America was the freest nation in the history of the world up through the end of the 19th century. But then something very bad happened. And what happened was that there was a kind of philosophic tsunami of ideas that crashed onto America's shores in the post-Civil War era. That is, ideas that came to the United States. America was founded on Lockean principles, on the philosophy of John Locke. And Locke's ideas existed and were the dominant philosophic moral ethos of the United States up until the Civil War. But in the post-Civil War period, these German ideas crashed onto America's shores, and then they just percolated down and through American culture over the course of a century.
Welcome to this episode of IPA Encounters. My name is John Roskam. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute of Public Affairs, and today I'm very excited to be speaking with Professor C. Bradley Thompson. We'll be talking about the future of the West, the future of education, and more importantly, what is a way forward for freedom. Professor Thompson is Professor of Political Philosophy at Clemson University in South Carolina in the United States, and he's the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He's been a visiting scholar at Princeton, Harvard, and the University of London. He is America's leading scholar of revolutionary America and the thought and ideas of the American Republic. He's published widely on history, politics, education, and he has a wonderful Substack that I can't recommend too highly, The Redneck Intellectual. Professor Thompson's videos for PragerU have been watched literally millions of times, and his discussions about Marxism, about the challenges to freedom are essential viewing. Professor Thompson, thank you for being with us on IPA Encounters today.
Hi, John. Thank you very much, and greetings to Australia.
Before we came on air, we were talking about elections coming up potentially in Australia, in the UK. Of course, you've got the presidential elections in November in the United States. What binds our democracies together, and what are the challenges we face?
Well, I think what's most important is what binds us together. And what binds us together, I would sum up in maybe three ideas: freedom, individual rights, and constitutionalism. These are the core fundamental ideas of the West. And maybe we could also add capitalism. I think capitalism ought to be added to that list. So these are the core fundamental ideas of the West that are and have been under attack for the last 100+ years. And these are the values that have to be defended in the face of an onslaught of ideas that are challenging the core central ideas of the West. And I would say that the core ideas that are challenging the West are one, nihilism, and two, socialism. So socialism is a political economic system, and nihilism is a moral cultural system. And these two ideas combined, nihilism and socialism, are the rot that is eating away at the soul of Western civilization.
We've seen protests in favour of terrorism in the US, colleges, here in Australia, around the world. Has something happened to hasten and magnify those attacks, and why are they happening at universities and against our education system when education should be opening minds, not closing them?
Yeah, and I would say actually, John, that what's been happening on American college campuses today is really the end product of what's been happening on American college campuses over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. So going back to the 1960s is where where America's, and I think probably true of all Western universities, took a very sharp leftward turn. And there has been a descent over the course of these last 60 years. I mean, when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student in the 1980s, I mean, it seemed to me at the time that the rot was as deep as it could possibly be, even then. But of course, it's only gotten worse over the course of these last 30 plus years. And, I think we saw, certainly in the United States, I think we saw a real change happen sometime around 2010, 2012. And the change was, I think, the introduction of social media, the introduction of Twitter, and Facebook and all of these other these social media forums that allowed the left to be able to organize in a much faster way than it had ever been able to organize before. And so since 2010, 2012, right, certainly American college campuses have become increasingly radicalized. So, in 2019, 2020, we saw the rise of Black Lives Matter. And of course, that radicalized American college campuses. And then in the last 8 months, since October 7th, 2023, we've seen the rise of what I call the intifada left. And these two movements, right? So Black Lives Matter on the one hand, and the pro-Palestinian, pro-terrorist intifada left. These are movements that are really just part of a broader movement. It's all a part of the left. And they're just looking for particular opportunities to exploit. And what they're exploiting most of all in the Western mind is guilt. They have found a way to weaponize guilt. And they certainly did that during in the United States during the summer in 2020, when America's cities were burning as a result of Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots. But it's the same ideology in the end that is driving what's happening on American college campuses today with the intifada left. Right. So, I mean, there are particular issues that they can find, identify, and exploit. But what all of these movements share in common is nihilism and socialism.
And what has been the response of administrators and politicians from your perspective? What explains their moral vacuousness, their refusal to confront the nature of evil, their refusal to call out this, as you say, this deep nihilism that students seem to be supporting and protesting in favour of?
Yeah, on the one hand, what you see up front is just complete and total capitulation on the part of high-level university administrators. But it's more than just capitulation. It's more than just the fact that these administrators lack a spine, lack principles. The fact of the matter is, in almost all of these cases, and we certainly saw this when in November, December, when the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT went in front of Congress and tried to explain what was happening on their campuses. And the fact of the matter is, most of these college presidents actually are sympathetic to the goals of the intifada left. So it's in part, in some cases, it's college university presidents who are nervous Nellies and don't have a backbone and are capitulating. But on the other hand, many of these university presidents have a deep and profound sympathy with the actions of the BLM rioters and the intifada left.
How then should centre-right politicians respond to this? Because so many of the developments that you've been outlining have been occurring under conservative national governments, conservative state governments. Until very recently, centre-right politicians have refused to acknowledge what is happening in colleges, universities and schools.
They have. And and to put it simply and crudely, what conservative politicians need is a backbone. But you can't have a political backbone if you don't actually have a political philosophy to support your actions. And the problem with conservative politicians, I think in the United States and certainly in the West, is that they actually don't have firmly grounded moral political principles. They put their finger in the mouth, they hold it up to the wind, they see which way the wind is blowing, and then they capitulate, right? But they don't have deeply held moral political principles. So, certainly part of the problem that we face today is our politicians. I'm sure the same is true. I know it's true in Great Britain. I know it's true in Canada. And I assume it's also true among conservative politicians in New Zealand and Australia, which is they actually don't have a political philosophy that they are willing to defend, right? They have absorbed, to one degree or another, they have absorbed the underlying moral philosophy of the left. And once they have done that, then it's only a matter of time. Conservative politicians typically only provide a break to the movement and direction of the left. They don't provide genuine, meaningful alternatives going in the opposite direction of the left. And so we need politicians who have firm moral principles. But, John, it's worse than that, because our politicians are only a reflection of who we are as a people. And if you think the politicians are rotten in democratic republics, then you have to understand that on some level, in some way, it's the people themselves who have also been corrupted. And so what we really need is a kind of moral revolution, right? That will change the culture. What has to happen is that the culture has to change. You can't have political change until the culture changes, right? And you can't have cultural change until the universities change, because the universities are the fountainhead of all bad ideas in the West.
I'm going to ask you about America's revolutionary mind, one of your most recent works, which is just outstanding. And you talk about the role of ideas, and you've just spoken about how politicians reflect the community, or how politics is downstream of culture. What's happened in 200 years? What has happened to an ideal of a self-governing republic with freedoms and rights and responsibilities that was an idea, and ideas accepted by a community, reflected by statesmen and your revolutionary founders? What's happened in those centuries to produce now the sorts of leaders we have?
America's late 18th century founding fathers created a free nation and a free society. They instituted what I call a laissez-faire constitution in 1787-88. And then over the course of the next 70 years, the ideas contained first in the Declaration of Independence, which provides the moral foundation of the United States, and then the Constitution, which provides the constitutional and political framework. It established the structure, the foundation and the structure of a free society. And then over the course of the next 60 or 70 years, ordinary everyday Americans began to live out the principles of the Declaration in the context of a free political society. And I think America was the freest nation in the history of the world up through the end of the 19th century. But then something very bad happened. And what happened was that there was a kind of philosophic tsunami of ideas that crashed onto America's shores in the post-Civil War era. That is, ideas that came to the United States primarily from Germany. So it's in this period that you get the introduction of the ideas of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. And so they're the big four German philosophers, and their ideas, which for the most part had not been in the United States at all. America was founded on Lockean principles, on the philosophy of John Locke. And Locke's ideas existed and were the dominant philosophic moral ethos of the United States up until the Civil War. But in the post-Civil War period, these German ideas crashed onto America's shores, and then they just percolated down and through American culture over the course of a century, right? These things don't happen overnight. They happen slowly. And of course, the challenge that these ideas face, these new ideas from Germany.
What were the key features of those ideas?
So I would say probably at the heart was the idea of what Hegel referred to as historicism. It's the idea that there are no absolute, certain, permanent, universal, fundamental truths with a capital T, right? What historicism says is that all ideas, all moral, philosophic ideas are grounded in the time in which they were produced. So what that means, for instance, as a concrete example, so when America's founding fathers declared in 1776 that, we hold these truths to be self-evident, keyword truths, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So America's founding fathers believed in the idea of truth that is absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And the idea of historicism says that the truths of the founding fathers were not absolutely certain, permanent, universal truths. They were just true for the time. They were true for 1776, but they cannot be true for 1896, right? In other words, moral truths are evolving, and they're evolving in one direction, and that direction is towards egalitarianism and statism. So, I mean, I would say that's the core idea. And connected with historicism, of course, is the idea of moral relativism, the idea that there are no absolute moral truths, that all moral principles are relative to time and place. So at the deepest philosophic level, I would say those are the most fundamental ideas, because those are the ideas that withered away sort of the American soul over the course of the next century. And then, of course, what filled the political principles of the American founders, which can be summed up in the idea of limited government, constitutionalism, and laissez-faire capitalism, was socialism, right? And then the socialist idea, it just slowly entered American culture beginning in the 1870s. And then with every passing decade, it just percolated down and through American culture further and further and further until you get to the point where we are today, which is, I mean, at best, you can say the United States of America has a mixed economy. It certainly doesn't have a laissez-faire capitalist economy. It's part socialist, it's part capitalist.
Can I then ask you how we begin to reverse this process? And let's start with schools and universities. Can universities be saved? Should they be saved?
All right, so that's a hard question, and it's difficult to answer as a university professor. And I'm torn. I'm torn, John. I've lived in the university my entire adult life. I've never done anything other than be either a student or a professor, right? And I have the best job in the world. Right? I get to read old books with young people, right? What could be better than that? And I get paid for it, right? So on the one hand, I love the idea of the university, but on the other hand, I understand as well as anybody does that higher education in the West has become entirely corrupted. And so to answer the very specific question you have asked, which is, do you think the universities can be saved? I think, unfortunately, the answer to that question, at least in the short term, by which I mean the next 20 or 30 years, the answer has to be, of course, no. They cannot be saved. The rot is too deep.
Can I ask you, was that decline inevitable? Is that an inevitable outcome of the philosophical influences that you've just been talking about? Is it an inevitable outcome of liberalism itself? Could this have been stopped or slowed before we talk about what happens next?
Yes, I mean, it could have been, right? But the problem, certainly in the context of the United States, is that at the end of the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century, there were no defenders of the founders' classical liberal principles, right? You would be very, very hard pressed to find any philosopher at all in the United States, in Britain, Australia, who defended defended the founders' principles, or the principles of what I call classical liberalism. It's nothing in life is inevitable, right? It could have been challenged, but we now know as a fact it wasn't challenged. Now, in the post-World War II era, you get the first attempts to fight back, intellectually to fight back, right? And you start in the context of the United States, you get the great Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. You get the American economist Milton Friedman. You get the novelist philosopher Ayn Rand.
You get your Leo Strausses.
Leo Strauss, exactly, right? And so, right, this is the first moment when there is a serious intellectual pushback. And I would say actually that we captured the moral high ground. We captured the philosophic high ground. I mean, liberalism by the end of World War II, by which I mean modern 20th century progressive liberalism, was philosophically exhausted by the end of World War II. And conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals had captured the philosophic high ground in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And we were on the cutting edge of ideas.
And in 1989, we thought we'd won. We thought history had ended.
That's right. We thought we...
So why didn't we take advantage? Why didn't those who believe in freedom, liberty and self-government take advantage of the capture of those commanding moral heights?
Yeah, that's obviously that's a central question, but it's a difficult question. And I would say, part of it is, certainly in the context of the United States, the conservative libertarian think tanks became obsessed just with public policy. They thought that after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, right, that is all we had to do was mop up what was left over of the Eastern Bloc, and we just had to start implementing our policies. But that didn't happen, right? The left did not go away after 1989. What the left did was that it went underground. It went underground for 10 or 20 years, and it didn't reemerge again until 2010. But when it reemerged, it had deepened its influence over the universities, and not just the universities, but the entire K-12 government school system. So what you end up having is a total education industrial complex controlled entirely by the left, right? So the left, and I mean, the left has controlled effectively American higher education since the late 60s, absolutely since the 1970s. But it really has also come to control K-12 education as well. And because all of the teachers who teach in the K-12 system are taught in the universities. And more particularly, they're taught in the single most corrupt institution in American higher education, which are the so-called education schools, right? The teacher training institutions, where, taking courses in bulletin board design is considered to be a legitimate academic course. right? But it was in the education schools, which are in the universities, and of course then in the universities more broadly speaking, where all of these ideas were then being taught to the teachers, but not just the K-12 teachers, but they were taught to the people who went into the media, who took over the law schools.
Our not-for-profits, our cultural institutions, all of those who produce our culture.
That's right. Every single culture opinion-forming institution in the United States, with the exception of a few conservative libertarian think tanks, are controlled by the left, totally controlled by the left, right? So the problem then, John, is much deeper than just the universities, right? There's no question. The universities are the problem. So to answer specifically your question, what can be done about the universities? Well, I mean, they can't be reformed, right? I mean, take Harvard, for instance, Harvard, Yale, or Princeton.
I mean, can I just say you wrote very movingly about your time at Harvard, a time in the past where there was a commitment to diversity of thought, to argument, and to inquiry. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that and the difference between then and now?
So I was a graduate student in the mid to late 80s and very early 90s. And I had a very different conception of how to be a graduate student. All right. I was not concerned about getting a degree. I was most concerned with studying under the most brilliant people. So I spent my time in graduate school, both at Brown University studying with the great historian of the American Revolution, Gordon Wood, but also at Harvard with the other great historian of the American Revolution, Bernard Bailyn, and the great political philosopher, Harvey Mansfield, right? So what I did was I just went and I found the best people to study with, right? And that is something which has been entirely lost in today's world, in the professionalism of graduate school. And it is the case that there was much, much more intellectual freedom, even in the 1980s. I mean, it was not what it could have or should have been, but certainly relative today, it was immeasurably better. And it was also more serious. It was less political. Right. I mean, this was a time when you had really serious scholars who dedicated their lives, to studying great ideas, great books, or great statesmen, all of which is gone now. I mean, all of the subjects in the humanities and the social sciences have been entirely politicized, right? You cannot today go to an Ivy League university and do a PhD on the American Revolution. I mean, it's just the single most important subject in American history is no longer studied.
And how are students responding to that? So it's been put to me over the years that one of the reasons that colleges don't introduce a great books course or a program on the Western tradition is that they would be run over in the stampede of students who actually desire to learn something.
Yeah, I mean, there is a movement. So let me focus on the good things that are happening right now, right? And let me begin not at the university level, but let me begin at the K-12 level. Because there is a revolution happening in the United States. The single best thing happening in this country is the homeschooling movement. Homeschooling has exploded in the United States. And at the heart of homeschooling is the idea of a classical curriculum. And what we have now is millions of children who are being homeschooled, which it turns out is clearly a superior form of education to virtually any kind of schooling. But we also have in this country the creation of classical private schools and classical charter schools. So right now, in other words, we have 5 or 6 million children who are being given a classical curriculum education. And what that means is that, first, it means, most importantly, right, is that we have a generation of young people who are actually getting very good educations. And secondly, what we have are kids and their parents who are demanding the same kind of education when they go to university, right? No parent wants to pay $100,000 or $200,000 to have their child go to an American university and have them completely corrupted intellectually, right? So there's a demand for this, and the good news, the really good news, is that the demand now is starting to be filled. So let me give you one concrete example, and this is something I'm very proud of, and have a strong self-interest involved with it. At my Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University, we have started an academic program. We started it 9 years ago called the Lyceum Scholars Program. And it's a scholarship program. We give scholarships to incoming freshmen, renewable over 4 years. And in exchange for the scholarship, they are required to take our 8-course curriculum, which uses a great books approach to studying the history of liberty, capitalism, the American founding, and the principles of moral character. And for each one of our students, we assign what we call a Socratic tutor, one of the faculty members who meets with his or her tutees every other week for 1 hour, the purpose of which is to help these young men and women translate the ideas that they're learning from these great books, say Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, into their lives here, now, today. And then secondly, the purpose of the Socratic tutor program is to engage these young men and women in conversations about the question of moral character, and their moral character in particular, because it's our belief you cannot have a free society made up of moral reprobates. And so this Socratic tutor program, right, is trying to reinvigorate the idea of moral character. So this is one real program that, and the demand for this program, John, has exploded. I mean, absolutely exploded over the course of the last 8 years.
So can I ask you, talking about a way forward, you've outlined a way forward through education. What are the other ways forward to bring about, I won't call it a moral realignment, but let's say a moral renewal, so that at the very least our cultural institutions are rebalanced, at the very least there's an acceptance of difference that there doesn't appear to be at the moment from the left?
I genuinely believe that the single most important social movement in the United States is the homeschooling movement. And the homeschooling movement is not simply about education. It's not simply about giving your children the kind of education that they cannot get in the government schools. It is also a moral revolution. It's a moral revolution in the sense that parents are taking ownership over the education of their children, right? Rather than pulling up to your local school when they start kindergarten and drop them off, say goodbye, and never see them again for the next 12 or 13 years, homeschooling parents are saying, no, we're not doing that. We're not turning our children over to the government, because let's be very clear. These are not public schools, as they're called in the United States. They are government schools. They are government schools because they are run by the government and they are run for the government, right? So what's happening with homeschooling is that parents are asserting their moral authority over the single most important thing in their lives, which is their children and the education of their children. So that is for me, that is the single most important thing happening, not just in the United States, but in the West.
Can I then ask your reaction to a comment that has been made often here in Australia, that many parents who perhaps hadn't gone to university themselves or college, and who hadn't contemplated their children going to university, can now see from university administrators, from leaders, from student leaders, the complete absence of morals. If any good at all has come out of the terrible events of October last year and the reaction to it, we now have a community who can see that our education leaders, so many of our politicians, cannot condemn evil. And worse than that, in some contexts, they will support terrorism. So that has this reaction started to permeate and percolate through the United States, whereby people for whom education had not been part of their intellectual milieu can see a complete absence of moral courage, a complete absence of leadership, a complete absence of an understanding of truth?
Yeah, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to have an Ivy League PhD to see what's obvious right in front of you, right? Which is the complete abnegation of moral responsibility of our political and cultural leaders. And that includes the leaders of our education system. And one of the very common criticisms you get, for instance, of homeschooling parents in the United States, right, is that, well, only wealthy parents or parents with college degrees can homeschool their children. This is false. This is absolutely false. My wife and I, we homeschooled our children for 18 years. Now, yes, right, I may be the stereotype of the Ivy League, PhD homeschooling his children, but I can tell you, I have met hundreds of ordinary, everyday Americans who did not go to college.
In the time that we have left, can I talk to you about young people? So there'll be many young people watching this podcast who have been so impressed with your skills as a communicator and your commitment to education. What advice would you give to a young person, 16, 18, 20, who is interested in ideas, who might not necessarily be centre-right, centre-left, but who's interested in understanding the Western tradition, who's interested in expanding their breadth of knowledge and understanding? And what sort of things should they be doing? And very importantly, what should they be reading? Because you've spoken passionately about the influence, for example, of Ayn Rand on you. Can you talk a little bit about what they should be doing and then what they should be reading? Absolutely.
So the most important thing is that I'm speaking now to young people. You need to be a self-starter. You need to fall in love with a book, right? Books have the power to change lives. I can tell you that a book changed my life. In fact, 2 books changed my life. When I was 8 years old, I am originally from Canada. I'm not American by birth. And when I was 8 years old, I read a book called The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution. And at that moment, I knew I was an American born in the wrong country. So that was the first book that changed my life. The second book that changed my life was a book that I read when I was 19. It was Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. And that book did literally change my life. I locked myself in my bedroom for 4 days, had my mother bring trays of food and put them outside my door. And I read nonstop, round the clock for 4 days. Read a 700-page novel. And when I finished the novel and walked out of my room, the world was different. I saw the world in a different way. And it had a profound impact on the development of my moral character and a profound impact on my intellectual awakening. And this too can happen for all young people. Right? You need to be a self-starter. If you're bored, right? So the single biggest problem with teenagers in the Western world is boredom. And it's boredom induced by their schools. So what you need to do then, my message to all young people is be a radical. Be a radical. Step outside the system. the system that is oppressing you, and go find a good book. It could be Plato's Republic. It could be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Cicero's De Officiis, Machiavelli's The Prince, John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Go find a good book, and it's going to be really hard. The book is going to challenge you in ways that you've never been challenged before in your life. But just stick to it. Just read it line by line, and get through it. And at the end of the tunnel, it will. I'm absolutely confident it will ignite your love of the pursuit of knowledge.
And for me, of course, it's George Orwell. 2 final questions. What advice would you give to parents and grandparents who have children and grandchildren wanting to explore the world?
My advice to parents is break free of the establishment, break free of the system. Education comes in many forms. And my advice to parents is, and this would also be true of grandparents, you need to take a positive role in the education of your children, whether you're a homeschooler or not. Even if your children go to school, whether a government school or a private school, you need to take control of your children's education. Have a family, like a family reading group, right? Devote a part of, take 1 hour on a Saturday afternoon and let the family sit around and read Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Read poetry, read a novel, read 1984 together out loud as a family. You'll both learn something, and it will bring the family together. And I just became a grandfather for the first time recently, and I can promise you that I'm going to be spending a lot of time reading to my grandson, and then all the other grandchildren that are going to come down the pike.
To conclude this wonderful discussion, can I ask a final question, please? Are you optimistic about the future?
Yes, I have to be. I have to be optimistic because my life depends on it. My happiness in the here and now depends upon it. And more importantly, the well-being of my family, of my children and my grandchildren depends on me being optimistic. If I were a pessimist or a cynic about the future, why would I bother fight for the future of my children and my grandchildren, right? Right? There is something in human nature, right? So there's an old saying by the Hungarian anti-communists in the 1950s. Situation hopeless, not yet bad, right? And it's the not yet bad which implies hope, right? We live on hope, all of us, every day in our lives. We live on hope. And hope is what drives us forward. Hope is what makes us love. And hope is what makes us fight for the future of our children and grandchildren.
Bradley Thompson, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of IPA Encounters.
Thank you very much.